God promised you something specific. You know He did. But right now, everything in your life looks like the exact opposite of that promise. What if I told you this isn't God breaking His word, but actually God keeping it in the most perfect way possible? It's a pattern that appears so consistently throughout the Bible that once you see it, you'll never read God's promises the same way again. I call it the opposite promise principle, and understanding it will give you unshakable confidence during seasons when everything seems to be going wrong. Here's the core truth we're unpacking today. Between the place where you receive a promise from God and the place where you experience the fulfillment of that promise, there will almost always be a wilderness that appears to contradict everything God said. This isn't evidence that God forgot His promise or changed His mind. It's actually proof that He's working exactly according to His perfect design. So buckle up, because what you're about to discover is going to revolutionize how you interpret the difficult seasons in your spiritual journey. 1. The milk and honey mirage. Let's go back to Israel's story because it perfectly illustrates this principle. God appeared to Moses in the burning bush with a very specific promise. Exodus chapter 3 verse 8 records God's exact words. He said He would bring them out of Egypt to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Can you imagine how that promise must have sounded to a nation of slaves? Milk and honey represented abundance, comfort, prosperity, and rest. Everything they didn't have in Egypt. Everything they desperately longed for. That promise kept them going through the plagues, through Pharaoh's resistance, through the terror of being trapped at the Red Sea. But here's what actually happened. The very first place God led them after their miraculous deliverance was the exact opposite of what He promised. For 3 days they walked through burning sand with 2 million people and not a single drop of water anywhere. This wasn't God making a mistake, and it reveals something profound about how God fulfills His promises. 2. The Abraham pattern. Let's look at the father of faith himself because Abraham's story is the blueprint for this divine pattern. God called Abraham with a very specific promise. Genesis chapter 12 tells us God promised to make him a great nation, to bless him, and to make his name great. The foundation of all those promises was that Abraham would have descendants, lots of them, as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. There was just one problem. Abraham was already 75 years old when God called him, and he didn't have any children. His wife Sarah was 65 and had been barren their entire marriage. God didn't immediately give them the promised son. Instead, He let them wait and wait and wait some more. 10 years passed, then 15, then 20. Every year that went by made the promise seem more impossible, not more likely. By the time Isaac was finally born, Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. This is the opposite promise principle in action. God promises multiplication but allows barrenness. He promises descendants but permits decades of childlessness. He doesn't do this because He's cruel or forgetful. He does it because the promise must be fulfilled in a way that leaves no doubt about who gets the glory. 3. From dreamer to slave. Now let's look at Joseph, because his story might be the most dramatic example of this principle in all of Scripture. Joseph was 17 years old when God gave him dreams that showed his entire family bowing down to him. Even the sun, moon, and stars were bowing in his dreams. The symbolism was clear. Joseph was destined for rulership, for authority, for a position of tremendous power and influence. These weren't just nice thoughts or wishful thinking. These were prophetic dreams given directly by God, and Joseph knew it. His father Jacob understood the significance of these dreams, even if he rebuked Joseph for sharing them so boldly. So what happened next? The one destined to have others bow before him was forced to bow before others. And it got worse before it got better. Even as a slave in Potiphar's house, Joseph maintained his integrity and was blessed by God. But that blessing led to false accusation of sexual assault and imprisonment. So now he's gone from favored son to slave to prisoner. Each step seems to be taking him further away from his dreams, not closer to them. But here's what Joseph understood that many of us miss. The wilderness that contradicts the promise is actually preparing you for the promise. Joseph couldn't rule Egypt from his father's house. He had to develop the character that could handle absolute power without being corrupted by it. He had to learn to forgive the unforgivable. When Pharaoh finally elevated Joseph to second in command of the entire nation, he was ready. The opposite circumstances had produced opposite results. The slavery produced freedom. The imprisonment produced authority. The rejection produced acceptance at the highest level. 4. Moses the shepherd. Let's talk about Moses, because his story reveals another dimension of this principle. Moses was born with a specific calling on his life. His very survival as a baby was miraculous. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace with the best education Egypt could offer. He understood politics, military strategy, and leadership. By age 40, Moses clearly recognized that God had called him to deliver his people from slavery. Acts chapter 7 tells us that Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would understand that God was using him to rescue them. So he tried to fulfill his calling in his own strength and timing. He killed an Egyptian taskmaster who was beating a Hebrew slave, thinking this would spark the liberation movement. Instead, it sparked his exile. Moses had to flee for his life into the wilderness. And here's where the opposite promise principle really kicks in. God had called Moses to be a deliverer, a leader of millions, a man who would stand before Pharaoh and demand freedom for an entire nation. So what did God do to prepare him? He made him a shepherd. And God had Moses do it for 40 years. Think about that. 40 years in the desert watching sheep. But here's what Moses learned in those 40 years that he never could have learned in Pharaoh's palace. He learned humility. He learned patience. He learned to hear God's voice in silence. He learned to depend on God's provision in barren places. He learned that a shepherd's job is to serve, protect, and guide, not to force and control. When God finally appeared in the burning bush and said it was time to deliver Israel, Moses was ready. Not the ambitious 40-year-old Moses who thought he could spark revolution through violence, but the humble 80-year-old Moses who knew he was completely inadequate for the task and would have to depend entirely on God. The opposite circumstances of shepherding prepared him for the promised calling of leading. 5. David's caves. David's story might be the most painful example of the opposite promise principle because the contradiction lasted so long and came from such an unexpected source. David was probably around 15 years old when the prophet Samuel came to his father's house, called him in from the fields, and anointed him as the next king of Israel. Did David begin his training as crown prince? Did the nation start preparing for the leadership transition? No, Saul tried to kill him. For approximately 10 to 15 years, David lived as a fugitive. He hid in caves. He ran from city to city. He even had to pretend to be insane at one point to escape capture. David had opportunities to kill Saul and take the throne by force, but David refused. He understood something crucial. The promise would be fulfilled in God's way and God's timing, not through human manipulation or violence. But here's what those wilderness years accomplished. They taught David to depend on God as his only refuge. They produced the Psalms that have comforted billions of believers throughout history. They revealed David's character and proved he could be trusted with power. They gathered around him the men who would become his mighty warriors and loyal supporters. When David finally became king, he didn't rule with the insecurity and paranoia that characterized Saul. He ruled with confidence, humility, and a deep understanding that the throne belonged to God, not to him. 6. The New Testament pattern. And you might be thinking, okay, those are all Old Testament examples. Does this pattern continue in the New Testament? Absolutely. Jesus himself experienced it. At his baptism, the heavens opened, the Spirit descended like a dove, and the Father's voice declared, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." It was the ultimate affirmation and commissioning. So what happened immediately after? Matthew chapter 4 tells us the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil for 40 days. After the greatest spiritual high came the greatest spiritual battle. After the public affirmation came private testing. After heaven opened came hell's assault. The Apostle Paul experienced it too. On the road to Damascus, Paul had an encounter with the risen Christ so powerful that it blinded him physically and transformed him spiritually. Jesus personally commissioned him to take the gospel to the Gentiles. But Paul didn't immediately start his missionary journeys. Galatians chapter 1 tells us he went away to Arabia, which was wilderness country, for approximately 3 years. Then he spent many more years in relative obscurity in Tarsus before Barnabas came and recruited him for ministry. Paul spent somewhere between 10 and 14 years in preparation after his dramatic conversion before his major missionary work began. During that time, he wasn't seeing massive results. He wasn't planting churches all over the Roman Empire. He wasn't writing the epistles that would shape Christian theology for 2 millennia. He was in the wilderness, learning, growing, being prepared. Paul later wrote to the Galatians that it was during this time that God revealed his Son in him, not just to him. There's a huge difference. Many people have God revealed to them through experiences, visions, or dramatic encounters. But God revealed in you means that Christ's character has been formed within you through the grinding process of wilderness experiences. That's what the opposite circumstances accomplish. They don't just give you information about God. They form the character of Christ within you. 7. Why God does this. So why does God consistently use this pattern? Why not just give us what He promised immediately without all the contradictory circumstances? Let me give you 5 crucial reasons. First, it ensures that God gets all the glory. When the fulfillment comes through natural means and human effort, we tend to take at least some of the credit. But when the promise comes to pass despite impossible circumstances, everyone knows it was God. Second, it develops unshakable faith. Easy victories produce shallow faith. But when you have to trust God through years of contradictory circumstances, your faith becomes deep-rooted and storm-proof. Third, it reveals and removes character flaws that would disqualify you from handling the promise. Fourth, it creates deep intimacy with God. When you're going through opposite circumstances, you're forced to cling to God Himself, not just His blessings. You learn to find your satisfaction in His presence rather than in favorable conditions. Fifth, it produces compassion and wisdom that enables you to help others. If you've only known easy success, you can't relate to people who are struggling. But if you've walked through the valley, you can guide others through it. Your wilderness becomes your ministry credential. The opposite promise principle isn't God being difficult. It's God being wise. He knows exactly what it takes to prepare you for what He's prepared for you. The promise is guaranteed, but the preparation is non-negotiable. 8. How to navigate the opposite. So how do you practically navigate seasons when circumstances seem to contradict God's promises? Let me give you some specific strategies that will help you not just survive these seasons, but actually thrive in them. First, anchor yourself in God's character, not your circumstances. Circumstances are temporary and constantly changing. God's nature is eternal and unchanging. When you're tempted to doubt His promises because of what you're seeing, remind yourself of what you know to be true about who He is. Second, document what God has said. Write down the promises He's given you, whether through scripture, prophecy, or that still small voice in your spirit. When doubt comes, and it will, you can go back and remind yourself of what God actually said. Third, look for what God is building in you, not just what He's building for you. The opposite circumstances are character construction sites. Ask yourself, what is God trying to develop in me through this situation? What character quality am I lacking that this difficulty is producing? Fourth, refuse to help God fulfill His promise through human manipulation. Abraham tried this with Hagar and created generations of conflict. Moses tried this with murder and ended up in 40-year exile. Saul tried this with impatient sacrifice and lost his kingdom. Trust God's methods as much as you trust His promises. Fifth, encourage yourself by studying other people's wilderness journeys. You're not the first person to walk through opposite circumstances. Read about Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and David. Study their struggles and their eventual triumphs. Their stories exist partly to give you hope during your own journey. Sixth, maintain a thankful heart even when you can't see progress. Thanksgiving is the language of faith. When you give thanks in the midst of contradictory circumstances, you're declaring that you trust God's plan even when you can't understand it. Seventh, serve others while you're waiting for your promise. The wilderness isn't a vacation from purpose. God often uses the waiting season to develop in you the servant heart that will sustain you when the promise comes. 9. The timing factor. Here's something that encouraged me tremendously when I'm in the midst of opposite circumstances. God's delays are not God's denials. Every single person we've discussed in this teaching eventually saw the fulfillment of God's promise. Abraham got Isaac. Joseph became prime minister. Moses led the Exodus. David became king. All transformed the ancient world. The promise came. It just didn't come immediately, and it didn't come easily. There's a specific reason for the delay. God is working on 2 timelines simultaneously. He's preparing you for the promise, and He's preparing the promise for you. Both have to be ready at the same time. Sometimes we're ready, but the situation isn't. Sometimes the situation is ready, but we're not. God's timing coordinates both to converge at the perfect moment. Think about Joseph again. If he had been made prime minister immediately after his dreams, he wouldn't have been prepared for the responsibility. But also, Egypt wasn't ready for him yet. The famine that would necessitate his administrative genius hadn't occurred. Pharaoh, who would elevate him, wasn't on the throne yet. God was preparing Joseph through slavery and prison, while simultaneously orchestrating events in Egypt's government, economy, and politics. When both timelines converged, Joseph was promoted in a single day from prison to palace. The wait wasn't wasted. It was essential. The same is true for you. While you're enduring opposite circumstances, God is working behind the scenes in situations and places you can't see. He's moving people, arranging opportunities, and preparing the environment for your promise to be fulfilled. Trust His timing. Trust His process. The fulfillment is coming. 10. The greater glory. Here's the beautiful truth that makes all the opposite circumstances worth it. The harder the wilderness, the greater the glory when the promise comes. The longer Abraham waited, the more miraculous Isaac's birth was. The lower Joseph fell, the higher his eventual elevation. The more David suffered in caves, the more glorious his eventual kingdom. There's a direct correlation between the intensity of the opposite circumstances and the magnitude of the fulfillment. God doesn't waste your suffering. He leverages it for maximum impact. Every tear you cry in the wilderness becomes a testimony of faithfulness when you reach the promised land. Every day you choose faith over doubt in contradictory circumstances becomes a foundation stone for unshakable confidence. Every moment you worship God despite disappointing conditions becomes a memorial of His worthiness. The generation that saw Jesus perform miracles was amazed, but the generation that believed without seeing was blessed. The people who only trust God when circumstances are favorable have a certain level of faith, but the people who trust God through contradictory circumstances have a faith that moves mountains. Your wilderness season is qualifying you for a level of spiritual authority and blessing that easy street Christians will never experience. The opposite circumstances aren't preventing your destiny. They're preparing you for a greater destiny than you originally imagined. When the promise finally comes, and it will, you'll look back on the wilderness and realize that every difficult day was worth it. You'll understand why God led you through such hard places. You'll see how each trial produced specific character qualities that you desperately needed. And you'll be grateful, not bitter, for the journey. Because the promise fulfilled after patient endurance is so much sweeter than instant gratification could ever be. Let me leave you with 3 truths that will sustain you when circumstances seem to contradict God's promises. First, opposite circumstances are proof of the promise, not evidence against it. The harder the contradiction, the bigger the promise God is preparing you for. Don't interpret difficulty as God's abandonment. Interpret it as God's intensive preparation. Second, the length of the opposite season is often proportional to the magnitude of the promise. Quick promises have quick preparations. Lifetime promises have lifetime preparations. Don't despise the years in your wilderness. They're producing something in you that instant success never could. Third, God is working on 2 timelines, preparing you for the promise while preparing the promise for you. Both have to be ready simultaneously. Trust His timing. Trust His process. The convergence is coming. If you're in a season right now where everything looks opposite to what God promised, take heart. You're in the same company as Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, and Paul. Your story is following the same pattern as every great man and woman of faith throughout history. The promise is guaranteed. The fulfillment is certain. The wilderness will end. Keep believing. Keep trusting. Keep moving forward. Before we wrap it up, I want you to do something practical right now. Think about a promise God has given you that seems contradicted by your current circumstances. Maybe it's about your family, your calling, your finances, or your health. Instead of focusing on the contradiction, ask yourself this question. What character quality is God trying to develop in me through this opposite season? Write down your answer. Then commit to cooperating with God's character development process, instead of just waiting for circumstances to change. If this teaching has given you hope and perspective, please share it with someone else who might be struggling with contradictory circumstances. Your share could be exactly what they need to keep believing during their wilderness season. Make sure you're subscribed to Walking with God and that notification bell is on, because in our next episode we'll be exploring exactly what God is building in you during wilderness seasons and why that internal construction is more important than external circumstances. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember this truth. When circumstances contradict God's promises, trust the promise maker, not your circumstances. He's never failed yet, and He's not about to start with you. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.